The day the lawyers left, my house went quiet in a way I had never heard before. The dining table was still covered with divorce papers, his signature dry and sharp across the bottom, like he couldn't wait to cut himself out of our lives. I told myself I was angry. I told myself I didn't care. Then my daughter walked to the door, still holding her crayons, and asked, "Mommy, where did Dad go?" I opened my mouth to say, "He chose to leave," but the words wouldn't come. Because minutes earlier, I had pulled a crumpled medical report from the trash stage 4, 3 months ago, the same week he started sleeping on the couch. He didn't look at me when he handed those papers to the lawyers. He didn't fight for custody. He didn't even argue. He just said, "You'll be better off." I thought he was abandoning us. But what if he was trying to disappear before we had to watch him die? If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from, and what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. The lawyers left at 4:17 p.m. I know because the front door clicked shut and the sound echoed through the house like something breaking that couldn't be fixed. The dining table was still covered in papers, our names printed in black ink, his signature slashed across the bottom of the last page. It looked rushed, sharp, final. I stood there, staring at it, one hand flat on the wood, as if I could press the papers back into blank sheets if I pushed hard enough. 3 months ago, he started sleeping on the couch. 3 months ago, he stopped reaching for my hand in the kitchen. I told myself there was someone else. It was easier to hate him than to ask why. My daughter was on the living room floor, coloring a birthday card that now had no address. She looked up when the door shut. "Mommy," she said softly, like she was afraid of the quiet. "Where did Dad go?" The question didn't hit my ears first. It hit my chest. I opened my mouth to say what I had rehearsed in my head all week. He chose to leave. He wanted this. "We'll be fine," but my tongue wouldn't move. The house still smelled like his cologne. His coffee mug was in the sink. His shoes were by the door. "He had to go out for a while," I managed. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone standing behind me. She nodded, accepting it the way children accept storms and bedtime. Then she went back to coloring. I walked into the kitchen because I needed something solid to hold on to. I gripped the edge of the counter and tried to breathe. That's when I saw it. The trash can lid wasn't fully closed. A corner of white paper stuck out between a cereal box and used paper towels. I almost ignored it. Almost. But something about the thickness of the paper made me pull it free. It was crumpled, folded hard enough to leave deep creases across the page. At the top, in clean blue letters, Oncology Department. For a second, the word didn't register. It floated there, disconnected from meaning. Then my fingers started to shake. The paper trembled so badly it made a dry rustling sound in the silent kitchen. Patient name, his, date. 3 months ago, the same week he moved to the couch. I scanned downward. Clinical words, numbers, terms I didn't fully understand, and then I saw it, stage 4. The room didn't spin. It didn't blur. It went painfully clear, the ticking clock on the wall, the hum of the refrigerator. My daughter humming to herself in the next room, every sound sharpened. "No," I whispered, but the word felt small. He handed those divorce papers to the lawyers without looking at me. He didn't fight for the house. He didn't argue about custody. When my lawyer asked about shared time, he just said, she should stay with her mother, calm, detached. Like he was already gone. I thought he was cutting us out of his new life. But what if he was cutting himself out of ours? I pressed the paper flat against the counter and read it again, slower this time. Treatment options listed. Prognosis percentages. Follow-up appointments. There were check marks beside some lines, blank spaces beside others. Why was this in the trash? From the living room, my daughter called, "Mommy, do you think Daddy will come to my birthday next week?" Next week. The report mentioned aggressive progression. Limited response. My throat tightened so hard it hurt to swallow. I folded the paper carefully this time, smoothing the creases as if I could smooth time itself. I didn't want her to see it. I didn't want this word stage to enter her world. I reached for my phone and scrolled to his name. My thumb hovered over the call button. If this was real, why didn't he tell me? Why file for divorce? Why look at me like I was a stranger? I pressed call. It rang longer than it should have. Just as I was about to hang up, he answered. What? His voice was flat, tired. I heard it then. Beneath the flatness, a strain, like he was holding something back. I found something, I said. Silence. Sign the papers, he replied. Don't wait. And then before he could mute it, I heard it. A cough, deep, wet, followed by the sharp clatter of something metal hitting the floor. The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my reflection faint on the dark screen. In the other room, my daughter laughed at something only she could see. I was holding divorce papers in one hand and a cancer diagnosis in the other, and I suddenly didn't know which one was supposed to hurt more. The line went dead, but the sound of that cough didn't. It stayed in my ear deep, tearing, followed by a sharp noise that didn't belong in an ordinary room. I kept the phone pressed to my face long after the call ended, listening to nothing. Mommy? My daughter called from the living room. Is Daddy coming to my birthday? Next week. I folded the medical report smaller and slid it inside my sweater sleeve. We'll see, I said. My voice came out thin, like paper pulled too tight. She went back to coloring. I grabbed my keys before I could change my mind. The drive to the hospital felt unreal, like I was moving through glass. 3 months. He had known for 3 months. The same week he moved to the couch. The same week he stopped kissing me goodnight. If there's someone else, just tell me, I had said back then. There isn't, he answered. I didn't believe him. Now I was pulling into the parking lot of the oncology department. The building looked too clean to hold something terminal. Sunlight bounced off the windows. Automatic doors opened without resistance. Inside, the air smelled sterile and cold. At the front desk, I gave his name. The receptionist typed, paused, and lifted her eyes. I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't disclose patient information without authorization. I'm his wife. Her expression softened but didn't move. I understand. But no. I stepped away before my voice betrayed me. The hallway to oncology stretched long and white. Nurses passed quietly. A cart rolled by. Somewhere, a monitor beeped in steady rhythm. Life measured in small electronic sounds. I saw his doctor before he saw me. The same face from the report. Doctor, I called. He turned. Professional. Guarded. I said my husband's name. Recognition flickered across his eyes. Then restraint. And you are? I'm his wife. The word felt uncertain. He inhaled slowly. I can't discuss specific details. I'm not asking for numbers, I said. My hands were shaking. I pressed them together. I just need to know if it's serious. His jaw tightened slightly. That was answer enough. Stage 4 diagnoses, he said carefully, required difficult decisions. The words didn't echo this time. They landed. How long? I asked. Silence. Not empty silence. Weighted silence. He didn't answer directly. You should speak with him. 3 months. He let me hate him for 3 months. He filed for divorce, I said. The doctor's eyes changed again, something like understanding passing briefly through them. Illness affects people differently. Illness. Not betrayal. Not another woman. Illness. I stepped outside before my knees gave out. The glass doors slid shut behind me with a soft mechanical sigh. I pulled out my phone and stared at his name. If he was dying, why push me away? I pressed call. He answered faster this time. What is it? His voice sounded thinner, controlled. Why didn't you tell me? I asked. A pause. Measured breathing on the other end. I don't know what you think you know. Stage 4, I said quietly. The words sat between us like something fragile and explosive at the same time. Nothing. Traffic moved behind me. A car door slammed somewhere nearby. But through the phone, there was only his breathing. Just finish it, he said finally. Low, firm. Don't drag this out. My throat tightened. You think this is about paperwork? Another silence. Then it came again, the cough. Not distant this time. Closer. Uncontained. I heard him try to pull the phone away, heard his breath fracture in the middle of it. A sudden heavy thud cut through the line. Not metal. Not a phone slipping. Something larger. Something that didn't get back up. Hello? I said sharply. Hello? No answer. Just the hollow sound of air moving somewhere far from me. I stared at the hospital entrance behind me, at the word oncology printed above the glass. And for the first time, the divorce didn't feel like the thing that was ending. It felt like something else already had. The line stayed open, but he didn't come back to it. I kept saying hello as I stepped away from the hospital doors, as if clearer air might fix whatever had just happened on the other end, but there was nothing, no breath, no movement, just the quiet continuation of the call timer climbing upward. I hung up and called again immediately. Voicemail. My body moved before my thoughts did. I was in the car, reversing too fast, my hands locked around the steering wheel while his last words replayed in my head. Just finish it. Don't drag this out. As if the divorce were the emergency. As if paperwork weighed more than the sound his body made hitting the floor. I drove without remembering the lights I passed or the turns I made. By the time I pulled into his apartment complex, my chest felt tight enough to crack. The building looked unchanged, neutral brick, identical balconies, curtains drawn in quiet domestic patterns. Nothing about it suggested collapse. I ran up the stairs, my footsteps echoing down the narrow hallway. When I reached his door, I hesitated for half a second, listening for movement inside. Silence. I knocked once, then, harder. Open the door. Nothing answered me. I tried the handle. It turned easily beneath my palm. The air inside felt stale, like it had been holding its breath. The blinds were half closed, cutting the living room into pale strips of light. His suitcase rested against the wall, half packed, shirts folded with precise edges. Not the mess of someone rushing toward a new life. The order of someone preparing to leave one. I stepped in slowly, calling his name, my voice sounding foreign in the small space. On the kitchen counter sat a glass of water and a prescription bottle turned face down. I didn't pick it up. Not yet. An envelope lay on the table. My name written across the front in his handwriting, steady, deliberate. Not hidden, not crumpled, waiting. I stood there staring at it, my pulse loud in my ears, before finally breaking the seal. Inside was a letter and a clipped document behind it. The document caught my eye first. Life insurance policy. Coverage amount increased. Effective date, 3 months ago. I didn't repeat the number in my head this time. I didn't need to. It was the week everything shifted. The week he moved out. The week he stopped touching me like I belonged to him. I scanned the beneficiary line. My name. And beneath it, our daughters. My knees weakened, and I lowered myself into the nearest chair. He wasn't leaving. He was calculating. I unfolded the letter with hands that refused to stay steady. The first sentence blurred before I forced myself to focus. By the time you read this, I hope you hate me. The words were clean. No dramatic confessions. No apologies layered in self-pity. Just careful honesty. The treatments aren't working. The doctor says we can try again, but it will only buy time. I didn't want you watching that. I didn't want her remembering me like that. You're stronger when you're angry. If you think I left, you'll move on faster. A tear slipped off my chin and darkened the paper. I thought about every argument we'd had, every accusation I threw at him, every time he stood there and absorbed it without defending himself. I thought he was hiding another woman. He was hiding test results. I didn't leave because I stopped loving you. I left because I couldn't stand the thought of you counting my breaths. The apartment was too quiet. Then, somewhere deeper inside it, I heard something. Faint, irregular, not from the street, not from the walls, a dull shift against tile. I lifted my head slowly. Another sound followed, softer, dragged. And beneath it, the steady overflow of running water. My heart dropped. "Hello?" I called, already on my feet. No answer, just water. I moved down the short hallway, each step slower than the last. The bathroom door was half closed, light spilled from inside, reflecting off the floor. Water was running hard enough now that I could hear it clearly. "Please," I whispered, not sure whether I was speaking to him or to whatever was left of my certainty. I pushed the door open. Water spilled over the edge of the tub, cascading onto the tile. And on the floor beside it was him. Water spilled over the edge of the tub, cascading onto the tile and soaking into his shirt as he lay half-curled on the floor beside it. For a second, I couldn't move. The water kept running, steady and indifferent, pooling around his shoulder. His skin looked too pale against the white tile. One arm was twisted beneath him, the other stretched toward the sink like he had reached for balance and missed. "Hey," I breathed, dropping to my knees. My hands hovered before I forced them onto his shoulders. Warm. He was warm. Open your eyes. No response. I reached past him and shut off the faucet. The sudden silence rang louder than the water had. I pressed my fingers against his neck, searching. There, a pulse. Weak, uneven, but there. Relief didn't come. It tangled with fear until I couldn't tell which was stronger. Why didn't you call me? My voice cracked as I lifted his head slightly and rested it against my thigh. His lashes fluttered. A shallow breath slipped from his mouth. I did, he murmured, barely audible. I grabbed my phone with wet hands and dialed 911, giving the address in clipped fragments. While we waited, I kept talking to him, tapping his cheek lightly. Stay with me. Just stay. His eyes opened halfway. Recognition flickered. You shouldn't be here, he whispered. Anger flared so suddenly it steadied me. You don't get to decide that. He swallowed with effort. I told you, to finish it. I'm not signing anything, I said. Not today. Sirens grew louder outside. I pressed a towel to the back of his head where I felt a tender swelling. When I pulled it away, there was only a faint smear enough to tighten my chest, not enough to explain the collapse. Why didn't you tell me? I asked again, softer now. He closed his eyes as if the question weighed more than his body. Because I know you, he said after a moment. You would have stayed. I am staying. That's the problem. The paramedics moved quickly when they arrived, gloved hands, measured voices, equipment unfolding with mechanical efficiency. They lifted him onto the stretcher while asking me questions. I answered automatically, his name, his age, what I knew of his condition. One of them glanced up. Are you his wife? The word caught for a fraction of a second. Yes. Whatever the paperwork said didn't matter in that hallway. The ride to the hospital blurred into flashing lights reflected against metal cabinets. I sat near his feet, watching the rise and fall of his chest as if it were something I could control by staring at it hard enough. Inside the emergency department, everything was brightness and movement. They separated us almost immediately. I stood with my back against the wall while nurses worked around him, attaching wires, checking monitors, speaking in calm, precise tones. I handed over the prescription bottle I'd taken from his counter. The label rattled faintly when the nurse set it down. After what felt like hours compressed into minutes, a different doctor approached me. Older, direct. He's stable for now, he said, but his cancer is advanced. I know, I answered. He nodded once. At this stage, treatment can change the calendar. It doesn't change the ending. The sentence didn't echo. It settled. Are we talking about months? I asked carefully. Or less. He didn't consult a chart. He looked at me the way people look at someone standing at the edge of something irreversible. It varies. Weeks. Possibly a few months. Weeks. The word pressed into my ribs like a fist. He signed refusal forms last week, the doctor continued. He chose to discontinue aggressive therapy. I pictured him alone in a consultation room, pen in hand, deciding to step away from the fight while I was at home accusing him of betrayal. Can I see him? I asked. When I entered his room, the lights were dimmer. Machines traced thin green lines beside his bed. He looked smaller against the white sheets, wires running from his chest like fragile threads. He turned his head when he heard me. His eyes were clearer now, but tired in a way that went deeper than exhaustion. You found the letter, he said. I nodded and took the chair beside him. Silence stretched between us, no longer confused, just heavy with what we both understood. I didn't want you hearing numbers in a hallway, he said quietly. I wanted you angry. It's easier to walk away from anger. There's nothing easy about this, I whispered. He studied my face as if memorizing it. The distance he'd kept for 3 months was gone. There was no shield left in his expression, no calculation. Just a man lying in a hospital bed, wires tracing the rhythm of a heart that was running out of time. And beneath the exhaustion, beneath the stubbornness, I saw it clearly now. Fear. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel right now so you don't miss the next episodes. Every subscription motivates us to keep bringing you better stories every day. And now we're curious. Where are you watching from? And what are you doing while watching this video? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to know where our viewers are around the world. Fear sat in his eyes for only a second before he blinked it away, like he was ashamed I had seen it. The monitor beside him traced a thin green rhythm, steady but fragile, each beat measuring something we no longer controlled. He turned his face slightly toward the wall before speaking again, his voice thinner now, stripped of the distance he had been wearing for months. "You shouldn't have come." I told him I had already been there, that I had walked into oncology before I found him on the bathroom floor, that I had stood in a hallway and heard strangers reduce our life to a stage number. His jaw tightened when I said it, not in anger but in resignation. He said he didn't want me hearing a word like that under fluorescent lights. I told him it didn't matter where I heard it. Stage 4 sounded clinical in a corridor. In this room, with wires taped across his chest and an IV dripping into his arm, it felt like a clock mounted above the bed. He shifted slightly and winced, and I reached for him without thinking, my fingers wrapping around his. His hand felt cooler than it had in the bathroom, but he didn't pull away. He said he had handled everything, the insurance, the apartment, the paperwork, so I wouldn't have to fight for anything later. I told him I didn't care about paperwork. He said I would when he wasn't here, and the sentence landed between us without echo. I asked him why he thought he got to decide that alone. He closed his eyes briefly and said he had been deciding alone for 3 months. I imagined him sitting in waiting rooms by himself, listening to doctors explain percentages while I was at home accusing him of betrayal. I asked why he hadn't let me come. He said, because I would have looked at him the way I was looking at him now, and he wouldn't have been able to leave. The machine continued its steady beeping. A nurse stepped in to adjust his IV and stepped out again, leaving us suspended in the quiet hum of hospital air. I told him I had found the insurance policy. He gave a small nod without looking at me. I told him he had increased it. Another nod. I asked if he thought that would replace him. A faint curve touched his mouth. He said nothing replaces him, but it pays the mortgage. I pressed my palm to my forehead and tried to slow my breathing. Then I told him there was more. After the letter, I had opened his laptop, thinking there had to be something else he hadn't said on paper. There was an email draft saved but not sent. A video file attached. His fingers tensed slightly in mine when I said it. I told him I had watched enough to understand. He had propped the camera up on the kitchen table, the angle slightly crooked, like he hadn't wanted to fuss with it. He cleared his throat before speaking, then stopped, then tried again. "Hey, kiddo," he said into the lens, softer than I'd heard him in months. "If I'm not there on your birthday." He paused, coughed, turned his face away for a second. When he looked back, his eyes were brighter, but he tried to smile like nothing was wrong. "I need you to be strong for Mommy," he said. The smile didn't hold. The video cut there. I looked at him now under the hospital lights and told him he was teaching her how to live without him. He swallowed slowly and said he was trying to. I told him she didn't need a lesson. She needed her father. His grip tightened around my hand with a strength that surprised both of us. He said she needed a version of him that didn't scare her. The words hit harder than anything the doctor had said. I asked if he thought disappearing would make that easier. He said it's easier to miss someone who walked away than to watch them fade. I leaned forward until our foreheads were almost touching and told him he didn't get to script our grief. He didn't get to rewrite us into something cleaner just because he was afraid of the mess. His composure cracked then. His breathing faltered. His fingers tightened around mine like he was anchoring himself to something solid. He said he didn't want her last memory of him to be a hospital bed. Outside the room, a cart rolled past, wheels humming against polished floors, life continuing in its usual rhythm. Inside, I realized the truth settling between us. He wasn't just afraid of dying. He was afraid of being seen while he did. He wasn't just afraid of dying. He was afraid of being seen while he did. I stayed there with my forehead almost touching his, listening to the uneven rhythm of his breathing, the steady beep of the monitor measuring time we no longer controlled. For all that time, I had thought he was pulling away because he didn't love me anymore. Now I could see it clearly. Every cold silence, every night on the couch, every sharp word had been a wall he was building so I wouldn't have to watch him collapse behind it. "You think you can decide how this ends?" I said quietly. He let out a breath that sounded heavier than it should have. "I know you," he replied. "You fight. You don't stop." "You're right." I tightened my grip on his hand. "I don't." He looked at me carefully, as if measuring whether I understood what I was offering. "There's nothing to win," he said. At this point, fighting just buys days. Then we buy them, I answered. Days are still ours. His eyes flickered at that, something fragile passing through them. I thought about everything I had mistaken for distance. The way he started folding laundry without being asked. The way he insisted on fixing the leaking faucet even though his hands trembled. The late nights at the kitchen table with his laptop glowing in the dark while I lay in bed convinced he was texting someone else. He wasn't cheating, he was researching survival rates. You were arranging everything, I said slowly. Like you were closing a house before winter. I was making sure you'd be okay. Without you, he didn't respond. The truth settled deeper. He hadn't filed for divorce out of anger or indifference. He had done it so I wouldn't be standing over hospital forms, so I wouldn't be legally tethered to every decision as his body failed. He was cutting himself out before the system could. You thought if I hated you it would make this cleaner, I said. A faint nod. That's not yours to decide. He closed his eyes briefly. If you'd known, he said, you would have looked at me the way you're looking now, and I wouldn't have had the strength to leave. Leave didn't mean another apartment anymore. It meant something permanent. A nurse stepped in to adjust his IV and left again, the door clicking softly behind her. The room felt smaller once we were alone. Are you in pain? I asked. He hesitated before nodding. Why didn't you say anything? I didn't want her to hear, he answered. Kids notice everything. Our daughter. At home, probably asking when Daddy would be back. You sold your car, I said, the memory rising sharply. You said we didn't need to. He didn't deny it. You moved money into my account. Silence. You changed the insurance policy. Another silence, heavier this time. You were planning your own absence, I whispered. He opened his eyes and looked at me without defense. I was planning your stability. I leaned closer. Stability isn't the same thing as a father. The monitor continued its steady rhythm beside him. I don't want her last memory of me to be this, he said, glancing at the wires, the IV line, the hospital band around his wrist. She doesn't get to choose perfect memories, I replied. None of us do. He swallowed slowly. I don't want her watching me get worse. Then we don't let her watch you alone, I said. We decide what she sees. We decide together. He studied my face as if hope were something dangerous, something that might hurt more than it healed. I don't know how to do this, he admitted finally, the words stripped of pride. Neither did I. But I knew this much. Disappearing was not the same as protecting us. You don't get to vanish quietly, I said softly. Not from her, not from me. His fingers tightened around mine, not with strength, but with intention. For months he had been stepping backward, slowly, carefully, trying to make the distance feel natural. Now there was nowhere left to step. For the first time since the lawyers walked out of my house with our marriage in a folder, we were no longer standing on opposite sides of the fight. We were facing the same thing, together. For the first time since the lawyers walked out of my house with our marriage in a folder, we were no longer standing on opposite sides of the fight. We were facing the same thing, together. The word felt fragile in a hospital room where machines translated breath into numbers and numbers into warnings. He drifted in and out of sleep as the night deepened, and I stayed in the chair beside him, afraid that if I looked away for too long, something would shift without me noticing. Every small change in his breathing pulled my body upright. Sometime after midnight, he tried to sit up too quickly. His hand went to his chest, fingers pressing hard like he could physically hold himself together. I can't, he started, and then the monitor made a sharper sound than before. Not flat, not gone, but wrong. I was on my feet instantly. Look at me, I said, leaning over him. His eyes struggled to focus. The green line on the screen dipped unevenly. A nurse rushed in, then another. Their movements were fast but controlled, adjusting oxygen, checking vitals, speaking to him in firm, steady voices. Sir, stay with me, one of them said. Stay. The words struck somewhere deep inside me. I stepped back because they needed space, and in that space I felt useless. My hands shook so badly I pressed them against my sides to hide it. The monitor stuttered again, a jagged rhythm that made my pulse spike in response. Is he crashing? I heard myself ask, but my voice sounded far away. We're stabilizing him, a nurse replied without looking up. Stabilizing. Not safe. Not fine. A doctor entered quickly, eyes sharp, scanning the screen. What's his code status? He asked. The question cut through the room. The nurse glanced at the chart. DNR signed last week. For a second, the words didn't register. Do not resuscitate. The doctor looked at me. Are you the legal decision maker? The hallway question from earlier came rushing back. Heavier now. Are you legally still his wife? My throat closed. The divorce papers were still unsigned on my kitchen table. Yes, I said. I am. He nodded once. He's indicated he does not want aggressive resuscitation if his heart stops. My vision tunneled. He doesn't get to make that call alone, I said, the words leaving me before I could soften them. The doctor's expression remained calm. He already has. On the bed, his breathing grew more erratic for a few terrifying seconds. The green line dipped again, then wavered. The room felt suspended over something irreversible. I moved closer despite the staff, needing him to hear me. Stay, I whispered. Stay with me. As suddenly as it had faltered, the rhythm steadied. Not strong, but steady enough. The sharp warning tones softened back into a fragile pattern. The doctor exhaled quietly and stepped back. The nurses adjusted the monitors, made notes, and one by one the urgency drained from the room, leaving behind a silence that felt thinner than before. When they finished, the doctor paused beside me. We need to clarify his wishes, he said gently. Soon. Clarify his wishes. Not save him, not cure him, clarify how he wanted to end. When we were alone again, I moved back to the bed. His eyes were open, unfocused at first, then settling on me. He had heard enough. I could see it. You see? He whispered. His voice was raw. That's what I didn't want. My chest ached. You don't get to carry that by yourself. I don't want to die in a hospital, he said quietly, the words more vulnerable than anything else he had admitted. I don't want fluorescent lights and strangers being the last thing I see. The machines continued their steady hum, but now every sound felt temporary, like it was counting down rather than keeping him alive. I don't want her remembering this room, he added. Not dramatic, not pleading, just honest. I looked around at the pale walls, the blinking screens, the IV lines taped to his arm. I imagined our daughter standing in this doorway, trying to understand why her father looked smaller than she remembered. He wasn't just afraid of fading, he was choosing the place where he wanted to disappear. And the doctor's question still echoed in my head. Are you the legal decision maker? Because if I was, then the next choice might be mine. Are you the legal decision maker? The question did not leave when the doctor stepped out. It stayed suspended in the air, heavier than the machines, heavier than the thin hospital blanket tucked around his legs. If I was the one who decided, then I was also the one who would live with the ending. He looked at me with eyes that were too clear for someone this sick. You heard them, he said quietly. I signed it. The DNR. The letters felt sharp in my head. He said he didn't want strangers breaking his ribs just to give him a few more minutes. I told him he didn't know it would be minutes. He answered that he knew it wouldn't be years. The certainty in his voice was not dramatic. It was calm. That frightened me more. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, as if the conversation had nothing to do with it. He told me he had signed the form last week. I asked why he hadn't told me. He said he had, just not directly. The distance, the divorce, the pushing away, that had been his version of warning. I felt something hot rise in my chest, not just anger but betrayal layered over grief. I told him to stop deciding what was easier for me. He said he wasn't trying to make it easier. He was trying to make it survivable. A nurse stepped back in with a clipboard, her voice gentle but procedural. She needed confirmation of his advanced directives. Ventilation, resuscitation, comfort-focused care. Each word translated into a boundary. She asked who would speak if he could not. He squeezed my hand, and I said that I would. The nurse handed me the papers. They felt too thin to hold something so final. When she left, he shifted slightly and looked at the ceiling before speaking again. He said there was more I didn't know. He had stopped chemotherapy 2 weeks ago, not paused, stopped. I felt the air thin in my lungs. You said it was just a break, I told him. It was easier to say that. For who? For you. I told him to stop choosing for me. He had done the math, he said. Another round would buy time but not change the ending. It would make the middle harder, the pain worse, the weakness more visible. He didn't want our daughter watching him shrink in front of her. She already knows something is wrong, I said. "She doesn't know this," he replied. The door opened again, and the doctor returned, chart in hand. He confirmed the decision clearly and without drama. No more aggressive treatment. The focus would shift to comfort, not cure. The word cure seemed to fade from the room the moment he said it. I nodded because my husband nodded. I told the doctor that if this was what he wanted, then we would honor it. The doctor looked at me carefully, making sure I understood what that meant. I did. I just didn't accept it. When the door closed again, the room felt quieter. Not peaceful, just smaller. "You're not fighting me," he said, studying my face. "I am," I answered. "Just not the way you expect." He searched my expression for resistance and didn't find the kind he thought he would. What he found instead must have unsettled him, because his voice softened. "I don't want to stay here," he said. The hospital lights buzzed faintly overhead. "I don't want fluorescent lights and strangers being the last thing I see," he continued. "I don't want her remembering this room." I imagined our daughter standing in this doorway, trying to reconcile the father who used to lift her onto his shoulders with the man attached to machines. "I want to go home," he said. Home. Not the apartment he rented to make leaving easier. Our house. The one where the divorce papers still sat on the dining table. The one where our daughter was waiting for an answer about her birthday. This wasn't about treatment anymore. It wasn't about chemo or percentages or forms clipped to a board. It was about where the end would happen. And if I was the legal decision maker, then the next move wasn't his alone. It was mine. The words settled between us in the hospital room like something fragile and enormous at the same time. Not the apartment he had rented to make leaving easier. Our house, the one with the unsigned divorce papers still spread across the dining table. The one where our daughter was waiting for answers I hadn't figured out how to give. I told him that if we did this, there would be no more pretending, no more distance dressed up as protection. He looked at me for a long moment and said he was too tired to pretend anyway. The next morning unfolded in careful, deliberate steps. A hospice coordinator arrived with a calm voice and a folder thick with forms. She spoke about in-home care, about equipment deliveries, about medications designed for comfort rather than cure. The words were gentle, almost kind, but they described an ending. I listened without interrupting, asking practical questions, signing where I needed to sign. If I was the legal decision-maker, then I would make decisions with my eyes open. By late afternoon, discharge papers were complete. The doctor reviewed the plan once more, explaining dosages, warning signs, numbers to call when the pain spiked or his breathing changed. No one used the word cure again. It had quietly left the room. When they wheeled him down the hallway, the fluorescent lights passed overhead one by one, and he kept his eyes forward. He did not look back. I followed the medical transport van home, my hands steady on the steering wheel. The house came into view like it always had, brick, quiet, familiar, but it felt different now, as if it were holding its breath. Our daughter was spending the night at my sister's. I had told her Daddy wasn't feeling well and that we were bringing him home. She had asked if that meant he would be there for her birthday. I told her yes. I did not explain what there might mean. They carried him inside carefully. The living room had been rearranged while we were gone. I had done it that morning before returning to the hospital. The couch was pushed back. The coffee table moved aside. A hospital bed now stood near the window where afternoon light usually pooled on the floor. Machines were set up quietly, cords taped neatly along the baseboards, as if this were just another piece of furniture. When the hospice nurse left, the house went still. He looked around slowly, taking in the framed photos on the wall, the bookshelf he had built years ago, the indentation on the couch where he used to sit every evening. "I didn't think I'd see this again," he said. "You never really left," I answered. A breath escaped him that might have been a laugh. I walked to the dining table. The divorce papers were still there, exactly as the lawyers had left them. His signature cut sharply across the bottom line. Mine was blank. I picked them up and held them for a long moment. 3 months of anger lived inside those pages. 3 months of accusing him of things he had never done. I folded the papers once. Then again. I didn't sign them. I carried them back to the living room and slid them into the drawer of the side table beside his bed. He watched me do it. "I found something else on your laptop," I said quietly. His eyes opened a little wider. "A document," I continued. "Not the video. A letter you saved but never sent." He closed his eyes briefly, and I knew he remembered every word. "You wrote that if I was reading it, you had failed to disappear," I said. "You said you wanted me to hate you so I wouldn't wait, so I wouldn't have to watch." Silence filled the space between us. "You were afraid I'd try to save you," I added. "I was," he admitted. I stepped closer so he didn't have to strain to see me. "There's one thing you miscalculated," I said. "I would rather lose you to the truth than to a lie." The words felt steady in my mouth. He studied my face as if searching for weakness, for a crack in the certainty. I didn't look away. "I thought if I cut cleanly," he said slowly, "it would hurt less." "It doesn't," I replied. Late afternoon light filtered through the window, softer than the hospital's glare. It rested on his face gently, touching the lines around his eyes, the familiar shape of his mouth. This was the house where we had argued, where we had laughed, where our daughter had taken her first steps. It did not feel like a place for disappearing. He squeezed my hand with what strength he had left. "If you're here," he said, "I don't have to run." And in that moment, I understood something that hadn't been clear before. He had never been running from death. He had been running from us, watching him reach it. He had never been running from death. He had been running from us, watching him reach it. That night, the house felt different, as if it understood something irreversible had entered it. The hospital bed by the window hummed softly, a quiet, mechanical presence in the living room where we used to argue about groceries and homework and whose turn it was to wash dishes. The lamp beside him cast a warm circle of light that made the medical equipment look less foreign, but nothing could disguise what it meant. I sat close enough to hear every change in his breathing, every uneven pause between inhale and exhale. For months I had imagined losing him to betrayal. Now I was counting breaths. He stared at the ceiling for a long time before speaking. "I thought if I planned it," he said slowly, "it wouldn't feel like falling." His voice was thinner here at home, stripped of the hospital's controlled distance. I asked him what he meant, though I already knew. He said he thought if he chose the paperwork, the timing, the place, then the end would feel less like something happening to him and more like something he had arranged. I rested my hand over his chest and felt the fragile rhythm beneath my palm. "You don't have to manage it anymore," I told him. "You don't have to protect me from it." He turned his head toward me, and in his eyes I saw something I hadn't seen during the doctor's briefings or the DNR conversation. "I'm scared," he said. Not defensive, not proud, just scared. The words seemed to take effort. He was afraid of the pain, he admitted, but that wasn't the worst part. He was afraid of losing control, of becoming someone unrecognizable before the end. Afraid our daughter would see him and not understand why her father looked smaller, weaker, quieter. Afraid she would think he had given up. "You didn't give up," I said, more firmly than I felt. "You chose to come home." "What if I fade before she's ready?" he asked. "Then I'll tell her who you are," I answered. "I'll remind her of every version of you that came before this one." He studied my face as if measuring whether I could carry that promise. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, headlights sweeping across the walls before disappearing. Ordinary life moving forward, unaware that inside this room time had narrowed to something sharp and precious. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment, "for making you hate me." I thought about the fights, the slammed doors, the nights I lay awake convinced he had chosen someone else. I had believed he was tearing us apart. He had been trying to soften the impact of what was coming. "I hated you because I was hurt," I said quietly. "Not because I stopped loving you." His fingers tightened around mine. "Say it," he whispered. "I love you," I said, and the words felt heavier than they ever had before. He closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing them. "I love you," he answered, barely above a breath. For a moment, everything else receded: the equipment, the paperwork, the future shrinking around us. There was only the sound of his breathing and the steady pulse beneath my hand. But beneath that fragile peace, something else pressed at the edges of the room. His breaths were still uneven. Each pause lingered just a fraction longer than the one before. I found myself counting without meaning to, measuring the silence between inhales. "Stay with me," I said softly, not because he was leaving yet, but because I could feel how thin the space between now and later had become. He gave the faintest nod, and as the night deepened and the house settled into its quiet, I understood something I hadn't let myself admit before. Love could hold his hand. Love could steady his fear. love could bring him home, but love could not slow what was already beginning to change. Love could hold his hand. Love could steady his fear. Love could bring him home, but love could not slow what was already beginning to change. The next morning, the house felt suspended, like it was waiting for permission to move forward. Pale light slipped through the curtains and settled across the hospital bed near the window. He was awake when I opened my eyes on the couch, watching me with a look that was both present and distant at the same time. "She coming home today?" he asked. "Our daughter." "Yes," I said. "After lunch." He nodded, gathering what little strength he had. His breathing was heavier than the night before, each inhale visible in the rise of his shoulders. The hospice nurse came by mid-morning, adjusted his medication, reminded me in a low voice what signs meant the end was close. I listened carefully. I did not let my face change. By early afternoon, a car door slammed outside. I stood before I realized I had moved. Our daughter walked in with her backpack hanging off one shoulder, hair wind-tangled, cheeks pink from the cold. She stopped when she saw the bed in the living room. Her eyes shifted from the equipment to me, then to him. "Daddy," she said softly. He pushed himself up a fraction, forcing his body to respond. "Hey, kiddo." She stepped closer, slower at first, then climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed. She studied his face with the kind of honesty only children have. "You look tired," she said. "I am," he admitted. She slid her small hand into his. His fingers trembled when they closed around hers. "Are you coming to my birthday?" she asked. The question seemed to slow the air in the room. He looked at her, then at me, then back at her. "I'm here right now," he said gently. "And today, that's what matters." She considered that and nodded, satisfied in a way only a child can be satisfied by the present tense. She began telling him about school, about a spelling test, about a friend who kept borrowing her crayons. He listened like every word was something he needed to memorize. I watched the effort it cost him. His breaths were shorter now, uneven. A faint sheen of sweat gathered at his temples. I stepped closer without interrupting them. "Daddy?" she asked suddenly. "Does it hurt?" He shook his head slightly. "Not when you're here." She leaned into him carefully, resting her head against his chest. His hand moved weakly over her hair. Then his breathing changed. Subtle at first, a deeper inhale, a pause that lasted too long, another breath that sounded thinner than the one before. I felt it before I fully understood it. "Okay," I said gently, keeping my voice steady. "Let's give Daddy a little space." She looked up at me, confusion clouding her face. "Why?" "Just for a minute." She slid off the bed slowly, staying close. I moved to his other side and took his hand. It felt cooler than it had that morning. His chest rose sharply, then held. His eyes were open but unfocused, as if he were trying to see something beyond the ceiling. "Stay with me," I whispered. He tried to draw in another breath. It came shallow, fragile. Our daughter stood at my side now, her fingers gripping my shirt. "Mommy?" she asked. "It's okay," I told her, though my voice barely sounded like mine. His chest rose once more, and then it didn't fall the same way again. The oxygen machine continued its low, steady hum, indifferent and mechanical. The room was so quiet I could hear the clock in the kitchen ticking down the seconds. I waited for another breath. One more, just one. But the silence stretched longer than it ever had before. And in that stretched, unbearable stillness, I realized the waiting was over. The silence did not arrive all at once. It spread slowly, like something seeping into the corners of the room. I kept my hand wrapped around his, waiting for the next breath, the next rise of his chest, the smallest correction that would prove I was wrong. None came. The oxygen machine continued its low, mechanical hum, steady and useless now. Our daughter's fingers tightened in the fabric of my shirt. "Mommy?" she whispered again. I swallowed, forcing my body to move. I leaned closer, pressing my ear near his mouth, as if proximity alone could call him back. Nothing. His eyes were still slightly open, unfocused, no longer searching. "He's resting," I heard myself say, though the words sounded thin. But children understand more than we think. She looked at his chest, then at me, and something shifted in her expression. "Is he?" She couldn't finish the sentence. I nodded once. The sound that left her was small, not dramatic, Not loud, just a soft fracture of breath. She climbed back onto the edge of the bed and pressed her face into his shoulder as if he might still feel it. I wrapped my arms around her and held both of them at the same time. One warm and shaking, the other already slipping into stillness. I don't remember how long we stayed like that before I reached for my phone. My voice was calm when I called hospice. I gave our address. I said the words clearly. "He's gone," saying it felt unreal, like I was describing someone else's house. The nurse arrived quietly, respectfully. She checked what I already knew. She spoke in a tone meant for grief, soft and measured. Papers were signed, instructions were given. I heard them without absorbing them. At some point, she asked if there was anyone I wanted to call. I looked down at our daughter and nodded. When they finally wheeled him out, the living room felt enormous. The bed remained, the machines remained, but he did not. The front door closed gently behind them, and the house exhaled. That night, I sat at the dining table after our daughter fell asleep in my bed. The divorce papers were still in the drawer beside where his bed had been. I took them out and laid them flat under the kitchen light. His signature stared back at me, decisive and controlled. Mine was still blank. For months, I had believed he was walking away. I had thought the lawyers were the beginning of our ending. I had thought betrayal was the worst kind of loss. I was wrong. He had not left because he stopped loving us. He had left because he loved us badly and imperfectly, and was afraid of being seen as he fell apart. He had tried to make us hate him so that we would not have to watch him fade. He had tried to write himself out of our story so the final chapter would hurt less. It did not hurt less. I picked up a pen and held it over the line where my name belonged. For a moment, I imagined signing it anyway, finishing what we had started. But the paper felt irrelevant now. Divorce requires two living people. What we had was something else entirely. Instead of signing, I tore the papers slowly down the middle. The sound was louder than I expected. I tore them again and again until his signature was no longer whole. I placed the pieces back into the envelope and set it aside. In the quiet kitchen, I finally let myself cry without holding back. Not the controlled tears I had shed in hospital hallways. Not the restrained breathing I had practiced beside his bed. This was raw and uneven and honest. When I returned to the living room, the space by the window was empty except for the faint outline where the bed had stood. I stood there for a long moment, my hand resting against the wall. The day the lawyers left, my daughter had asked where her dad went. I hadn't known how to answer then. I thought he had chosen to leave us. Now I understood. He hadn't gone anywhere. He had stayed until the very last breath. And this time, we had been there with him,